Hi there BookTube, and welcome to the first video of 2019. It's going to be mainly a TBR, but just to frame that, in that last year I had a really good reading year, both in terms of the numbers of books, which was about 105, 106 at the end, but also the quality of the books. I don't think I'm going to be able to match that this year. I just have a feeling. Last year there was an awful lot of time sort of waiting for things to happen around my book. And I used that time by reading because I didn't feel I could write. This year I've got two things on the go. One is the follow-up book. When I say follow-up, I don't mean it's part of the series, but just the next novel is already written, and so I need to sort of push that out. And I've started a new project, which is probably going to be a novella length. So there's going to be less sort of free time for reading than I had last year. But having said that, I have lined up some books. I'll talk about my TBR pile. Now, I am a mood reader, so all the books I'm going to show you today, my TBR pile, doesn't mean they're going to be the first books I'm going to get to. They're just the ones I have to physically have around me that I could pick up and turn to. But, you know, it's quite feasible that I'll see something about a book and, you know, buy that, and that will go to the top of the pile for no good reason. So for example, one book I don't have here yet is Jarrett Kobeck's Only Americans Burn in Hell, because that's published on I think the 24th of January. Whenever that arrives, that will go to the top of the pile, because Jarrett Kobeck is one of my favourite authors. Okay, but I will show you what I've got anyway. So I'm currently reading, this is the first book I've picked up since the new year, The Stars at Noon, a Dennis Johnson novel. So Dennis Johnson was an author I was turned on to last year by Curtis at Curtis Books and Books. I read a book of his short stories called The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, and then I read his novel Train Dreams, and were both excellent. This is one of his earlier novels. It's set in Nicaragua during the time of the Contras and the Sandinista, and I'm only about 60 pages in, but so far it's what Johnson seems to have is this sort of mixture of sort of seamless, easy prose, and yet it's very taut and tense, and it's quite an interesting sort of double pivot to pull off. So I'm really enjoying that. One book I do know I'll be reading, and I do know when I'll be reading, is Overton by Adam Thorpe, because this is a buddy read with Jason at Jason Old Blues Chapter and Verse channel. We are due to read this on the 20th of January, which happens to be my birthday. That's where that came from. 20th of January is a really miserable date usually, because every 4 years or so I share it with numpties like Reagan, two Bushes, Trump having their inauguration speeches. But, you know, this year there isn't one of those guys pissing me off, and I'm starting a buddy read with Jason, so that should be good. Again, in no particular order. T.B. Fisher, How to Rule the World. T.B. Fisher is a writer. I've read 3 of his novels. He's British, despite his name, because he's of Hungarian extraction. Very, very funny writer. Now, I did ask in one of my videos, you know, what's happened to T.B. Fisher? There doesn't seem to be anything new from him for a while. And interestingly, on the back here, it says, this is the New Statesman. T.B. Fisher is the LEG of literature. Well, that's a bit unfortunate. Perhaps the best tribute to Fisher is that he is one of the handful of authors of whom one asks in hopeful anticipation what he or she is going to do next. And that's absolutely right. That's how I feel about Fisher. And I was a bit sort of worried that nothing had come for a while, but here we are. I think this was published last year. Yeah, this was published in 2018. I didn't know anything about it. I just happened to do a look, you know, a sort of spot check, as I do periodically in authors I like, see if I've missed anything, and this came up, so I was delighted. So that will probably be a January read. The Melancholy of Anatomies, stories by Shelley Jackson, not to be confused with Shirley Jackson, she of the ghost story. So I was on Twitter talking with 2 fellow writers, Joanna Walsh and James Knight, both of whose work I've read. In fact, I reviewed James Knight Void Voices in one of my last wrap-ups last year. And Joanna was talking about, no, in fact, James started talking about books where you plot your own your own path through the narrative. And I said, oh yeah, I've read a couple of those. B.S. Johnson, his book The Unfortunates, which I talk about in my B.S. Johnson overview. I'll post a link to that. And Joanna Walsh's Seed, which is, I think a book was released. I haven't read that one. I've read other Joanna Walsh stuff. I think that was a book for mobiles, so again, you could sort of, click on something and it will take you to a different part of it. And the reason I haven't read that is because I don't have a smartphone. So Joanna came back and talked about other books that influenced her in that project, and this is one she mentioned, and James said, oh yeah, that's brilliant, I love that book, and I hadn't read it, and I hadn't heard of Shelley Jackson. So this is a book of short stories. Here the body is turned inside out, its members set free, its humours released upon the world. Hearts bigger than planets devour light and warp the space around them. The city of London has a menstrual flow that gushes through its underground pipes, and a floating fetus larger than a human becomes the new town pastor. In this debut story collection, Shelley Jackson rewrites our private passages and translates the dumb show of the body into prose as gorgeous as it is unhygienic. Well, that sounds right up my street, so I'm looking forward to that. Denise Smith, Don't Call Us Dead. Well, I don't read a lot of poetry. Everyone was hyping about this book last year, which is why I've left it a year, because I don't really do hype. But when people were hyping about it, I did go onto YouTube, saw him performing one of the poems, and it blew me away. So I have been keen to sort of, come to this, but I did want the hype to die down. So I think it's finally died down sufficiently. People's attention spans have moved on to something else, and so I've invested in this, and I'll be reading it. I imagine, I know it's probably sort of quite hard-hitting emotionally, but I imagine I can do that in a day. It's just finding the mental space when I'm ready to do it. William H. Gass, Middle C. So I read Gass's Setter's Luck last year, which is his debut novel from 1966. This is his latest novel. He's quite old now. When was this published? So he's only published 5 novels. Setter's Luck I've read. Willie Master's Lonesome Wife, which is quite an experimental, sort of almost pamphlet sized book. I've read that. I've got The Tunnel to read. And then there's 2 others. So this was published, as I say, quite recently for him. Why does 2013. He's quite old now. So I'm looking forward to this. The only problem is deckled edges, yes, because it's Alfred J. Knopp, I'm sure, because they're always deckled edges and they drive me mad. Can't see who has published this. Yes, Alfred A. Knopp, of course, because the king of the deckled edges. Right, Clarice Lispector, The Passion According to G.H. I've read 2 Lispector books, loved them both. Wasn't sure reading the blurbs of the others, but someone was talking about this on either BookTube or Twitter. And I said, oh, that sounds good. So I've invested in this. G.H., a well-to-do Rio sculptress, enters the room of her maid, which is as clear and as white as an insane asylum from which dangerous objects have been removed. There she sees a cockroach, black, dusty, prehistoric, crawling out of the wardrobe, and panicking slams the door on it. Her irresistible fascination with the dying insect provokes a spiritual crisis in which she questions her place in the universe and her very identity, propelling her towards an act of shocking transgression. Clarice Lispector's spare, deeply disturbing yet luminous novel transforms language into something otherworldly and is one of her most unsettling and compelling works. I mean, that sounds fabulous. Slight echoes of Kafka with the cockroach and Alan Rob Grier in one of his books, which has a squash bug at the sort of marker of time as the light of the day plays on it and shows it in different ways, a bit like sort of Manet's water lily painting. Anyway, this sounds great. I picked up last year a couple of Tim O'Brien novels. Tim O'Brien, Going After Cacciato and In the Lake of the Woods, simply because the things they carried by him is just one of my favourite books of all time. Didn't quite make my top 10 BookTube list. And I didn't even realise he'd written anything. I don't know why. I just... and that, I went on Amazon, looked up, saying, I know he's written lots of books. So, at some point I'll get to at least one of these. Next, Anna Burns, No Bones, which obviously, having read Milkman and loved it, made my number 2 spot in my top 10 last year. I wanted to see what else she'd done. She's written 3 books. This is one of them. Apparently, it shows her. You know, it's a ladder of developments that Milkman may or may not be apotheosis of her talent. This is an earlier work and therefore, you know, isn't quite as well developed as that, but still be interesting to read. Street of Thieves by Matthias Enard. Well, I'm a huge Enard fan. His book, Tell Them of Battles, Kings and Elephants, was number 3, I think, in my top 10 chart last year. This was his first book, or at least the first one published in English, and I think possibly even the first fiction work published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, although don't hold me to that, could be wrong on that. And this is what it says on the back. Patrick McGuinness, author of The Last 100 Days, says, "This is what the great contemporary French novel should be. Enard looks at the world as it is, poisoned by religion, poisoned by politics, choking on materialism and dying of globalisation. His prose bites and his characters retain our sympathy, however extreme their actions. Enard fuses the traditions of Céline and Camus, but is his own man." And, you know, I think Enard is fabulous. I think French novels are going through a bit of a renaissance currently. There's him, there's Binet, there's the Enfant Terrible Houellebecq, there's Virginia Despentes. Who else did I read last year? Oh yeah, there's Edouard Louis, although I'm not sure I'm a fan of his, but I think he does important work. So it seems to be a real sort of bubbling up of really interesting French fiction at the moment. The Idiot by Elif Bautuman. I bought this because it's about a student of language. I know it's about a lot more than that, but I'm always interested in anything to do with language and how we acquire language and how language works and doesn't work. So that was my interest in it. It's not a high priority read. A lot of people are pretty down on this, say it could do with editing. Another book I know I will be reading in 2018 again relates back to Jason at Old Blues Chapter of Earth, which is Kent Haruf, Benediction. Because Jason, if you don't know, and if you don't know, you ought to go and check this out. He's doing an online booktube course, or class really, on mortality in literature, and this is his book for next December, for December 2019, the final one in his course. And I can't commit to participating in the course as a whole, month by month, but I will, you know, read this and definitely participate in the December sort of online analysis that Jason's going to be doing. And he recommended me this book in the first place. It's about a guy who's dying in the bosom of his family. So when my current work in progress is about death, but I keep getting ground down on the difference between first-person death and third-person death in literature. Third-person death being about the hole that somebody leaves or the characters left behind. It's about bereavement and grief, and that's done. You know, there's so many fantastic examples of that. You know, that's not my territory of death. My territory of trying to write first-person death, trying to write your own death, which is much less a trodden path. So there's a bit sort of Virginia Woolf, Henry James. I think David Markson does it in This Is Not a Novel, Vanishing Point. William Gaddis does it in A Gape, A Gape, which he was literally writing as he was dying. Of course, it's very hard to write your own death because no one has any experience of their own death, but that is the challenge, and that is my current work in progress. And it's why, as I say, I'm more about sort of trying to grapple with first-person death than third-person death. Anyway, so this sounds like an example of third-person death because it's about, you know, somebody dying and the family left behind. And finally, On the Origin of Stories, Evolution, Cognition and Fiction by Brian Boyd. So I don't read a lot of non-fiction, but I had quite a good year last year with about 12 books that I read, apart from one which is my worst book of the year. I saw a fellow booktuber talking about this on her channel. Sorry, I can't remember her name. I will post it in the notes and link it because it was in her TBR pile for 2019. And this sounds right up my street. So if I just sort of tell you the chapter headings, I don't mean each individual chapter, I mean the sections. So start off with evolution and nature, which is probably, you know, what it says. But then we have evolution and art. You know, what role does art play? Is it, is it a sort of unnecessary sort of indulgence by mankind, or does it have a sort of evolutionary, point to it? Part 3, evolution and fiction. So having had evolution and art, it goes to evolution and fiction specifically, which obviously as a writer I'm interested in. And then book 2 goes from Zeus to Zeus, origins and stories. So it looks at the Iliad or the Odyssey and Dr. Zeus as its 2 examples, which sounds rather fun. I ought to say that, you know, last year I bought, I can't remember what it was called. Hang on, I shall go and get it. Yes, so last year I bought Mapping and Meaning by Jordan Peterson. Yes, that guy is all over the internet winding people up. But, you know, before he became a right-wing bogeyman, he wrote this very serious-minded, I mean, his background is in psychology, or possibly psychoanalysis. He wrote this very serious-minded book on the architecture of belief, which, why would people in different places and times formulate myths and stories with similar symbols and meanings? Are groups of people with different religious or ideological beliefs doomed to eternal conflict? Are the claims of science and religion totally irreconcilable? What might be done to decrease the individual propensity for group-fostered cruelty? So again, you know, not dissimilar to that. It seems to be about the origins of story and myth. But I've only read 24 pages into it. Oh no, 27 pages into it. And I put it down because it's going to be a Jungian argument. And you'll see in my retelling myths video, which I'll post a link to, that I'm not into Jung for lots of reasons. I will go back to this, I will give it a chance, but this has sort of superseded it, and I'm much more interested in forging ahead with this, you know, to explore the themes rather than this. So there you have it, that's my TBR pile. There's one other book which I haven't received yet. Actually, I said that Quebec is going to be 24th January. That's not true. It's in April. The one that's going to be the 24th of January is a new Jeff Noon novel, which I can't remember the name of. Apologies. Again, I'll post it in the show notes, which I think I've pre-ordered. I hope I have. Now, Jeff Noon is a writer of science fiction usually, or he does his wonderful radical experimental literary books, Cobra Lingus being one of his, which did make my all-time top 10 books in that BookTube poll. I think I put it as number 1, or I put it as number 2, I can't remember now. Anyway, so those are the 2 sort of types of Jeff Noon books, but this one looks a bit different, unless I've misconstrued it. This is a sort of political commentary book on the current state of Britain. It's fiction. I wouldn't say Noon was, you know, overly political in his other works. I mean, there's bits of politics in there, but you know, his science fiction is more about sort of, you know, telling stories and you know, the sort of human being sort of recast with sort of gene splicing, so that, you know, people wear, you know, half man, half fox, and dog boys and all this sorts of stuff. So I'm going to be really intrigued because, you know, Jeff Noon is one of my favourite writers, but this is a step into the unknown for him, and I'd be interested to see how he gets on with it. So there you have it. That's my sort of TBR part for what it's worth. Obviously, as and when I read some of those, I will be making videos. And yes, here's to a good reading year. Thanks very much. Till next time.